Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah Rapaner. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. On today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about the mom flu. Do you get the mom flu? Have you ever heard of the mom flu? You haven't. You know why? I just made this idea up. So let's see if you believe me. I'm going to start with a couple questions. Do you get sick a lot? I mean, do you find that you are constantly battling small colds or flus? Or if someone in the house gets sick, do you also get sick too? And if you're in a partnership, what does it look like for your partner? Do they get sick or ill at the same rate? Or is it always you who's the one who picks up every single germ that comes in the family? On today's podcast, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to share through some speculative thoughts that I have as I was researching the previous podcast that we did. See, I was researching this podcast about, do women feel more pain? And of course, you should listen to it because it's fantastic. But in looking at kind of the research that was on what was happening for women in pain, I started to read all this other stuff about illness. And I started to think about illness and its connection to women in their roles as caregivers. And so I wanted to unpack this idea, like, is our care making us sick? Does actually the fact that women are much more likely to step into caregiving roles open them up to more infection, more risk of illness? We often talk about the man flu, and maybe we could extend that to the dad flu, but I want to talk to you about the mom flu. Have you ever heard of it? You probably haven't, because I literally just made it up. But as I share through what I mean by what is the mom flu, does it resonate with you? Does it make sense? Or what do you think? Am I off? So on today's podcast, we're going to unpack, is it a misperception or not? Does caregiving make women sick? Or put another way, is doing all of the dishes in the childcare giving you the mom flu? Is the mom flu real? I started to think about this as I was researching, this previous podcast, and I was reading a bunch of articles that came outside my field. I was reading stuff from immunologists. I was reading stuff from, public health people, from doctors. And thanks to all of you, I started to read an article about gender differences in pain. And then all of a sudden I'm reading about our T cells and parasites and whether parasites actually, have these gendered experiences. Like, does disease impact parasites in different ways? And does that look different based on the gender of the parasite? I'm not joking. This is the kind of world you all have pushed me into, and I am not complaining. I am very satisfied. And so I started to think about this biological kind of physiological differences of women. And I want to be clear that, we know that actually women and men experience disease, pain, and their immune responses are different based on their gender. And I talk about this in the previous podcast. We also know there's a lot of research that needs to be done to better understand women's experiences. And we also can see from the COVID-19 pandemic that it was men who actually were dying at higher rates than women, that the disease had this gendered impact, the virus had this gendered impact. And so I want to be clear on what I'm saying here. I am not saying that there is no physiological, biological, immunological, neurological, and all of the logical experiences of illness. Those are fact. This is not my area of expertise. And that is true knowledge. But I want to point out that some of our patterns at home may structure the extent to which we get sick, and that these patterns may be gendered. I've thought about this in part because in my house, here's what happens. I seem to be able to pick up every single illness that comes in the house, small, big, little tangential, whatever. And my husband doesn't actually get sick very often. He's pretty much healthy for most of the year. When he does get sick, he rarely takes time off. He keeps doing his regular life and he doesn't rest necessarily. Now, of course, I do scold him for this, and sometimes I'm a little bit guilty of the same behavior, but I want to be clear that he is in charge of himself and I am in charge of me, and that is what adult life is. But somehow I end up getting sick all the time. And I seem to pick up these little things and I seem to pick up the big things. And I started to think about why that was. Like, is there something physiologically different than us between him and I? Is it about the hormones? Is it the ways in which our bodies fight against defenses? Or is there something about the ways in which we care? Now, again, you can go back to our Women in Pain podcast and we talk about some of the kind of biological factors that contribute to different experiences of pain. And so again, of course, these things are true. But what I want to talk to you today is about how what we do at home might lead us to getting the mom flu. Now, I know from decades of research as a sociologist studying these types of things that housework and childcare are gendered, that women do certain types of these tasks. They tend to take on more of the core housework tasks. This means they're doing the dishes, they're cleaning the toilets, they're clearing the tables, they're washing the laundry, they're cleaning the bathrooms, they're doing all of those core tasks that are essential for our day-to-day functioning. We also know that men are much more likely to do the episodic chores. They're doing the raking the leaves, the car maintenance, and the financially keeping track of the bills. There are gender differences in what we do at home. We also know from our research that men, of course, have stepped into more of the primary housework tasks. They're much more likely to cook now than in the past, and they are more likely to clean in ways that perhaps were not similar for their fathers. And we know that these are gendered patterns that are shifting, but we still do know that women hold the bulk of this labor. Okay, so women are doing those primary chores. On average, and this is pretty static. Even if men step in, women are still holding this work. We also know from decades of research that women tend to do more of the primary childcare. They're doing more of the intensive time with children. They're doing more of the reading books, the snuggling in bed, the helping with homework, that kind of primary tasks. So they're taking care of children in these primary ways. They're doing the core housework and they're doing the primary childcare. And that while this is changing, this still is not gender equal. Women step into these roles. So these are the facts. I've probably done 15 podcasts on this, and there's a bunch of research to back it up. So why am I connecting this to the mom flu? How am I saying that this is actually a contributor to the mom flu? Well, again, I was reading an article about parasites. And in the article about parasites, I was trying to think about, do I share this with you? Do you care about the gendered nature to parasites? And what I really thought was interesting, I kind of decided you probably don't, or maybe you do, but what this article was basically talking about was that when we think about infection, we have to think about the dose exposure. Like, does it matter how much exposure to, say, a virus or a bacteria or a flu or a cold that you get? And how does that lead to your chance of illness? And they were trying to talk about, is this gendered, right? So we know that women are, and men may be more susceptible to certain disease, but it's talking about whether that dose matters. Now, during the pandemic, we thought a lot about dose exposure. We thought a lot about how much of the COVID virus was in the air. This was why we did all those things we did. We social distanced. We aired out rooms, right? We thought about breathing in air, in part because we were thinking about is reducing the exposure to a high dose of COVID infection. And the idea was, right, like that if we diffuse the virus around, that if we get a small dose, we're much more likely to have our body able to fight it off. But if we get a large dose, if we're in those rooms where there's high concentration, that our chance of getting the virus was pretty high. And so we did all these things to try to reduce or minimize our dose exposure. So I want you to start thinking about dose exposure. How much of a dose exposure do you get through caregiving? And I want you to think about that in the connection to exposure to disease. Let me give you an example from my own life. When my daughter was very young, say 1 or 2, I was the primary caregiver, in part because I spent more time. Now, there was a bunch of reasons why I did that, and there's a bunch of research showing that when Children spend more time in primary care with the one parent. They're much more likely to go to that person when they're sick. So if the little kids are there and they're in the primary care of mom, they're much more likely to go to mom when they're ill. If, of course, they're in the primary care of dad or an equal 50-50 between, they're much more likely to go to dad, or if it's equal 50-50, they go to either parent. So little kids are going to the primary parent when they feel unwell. What this meant was that when my daughter got ill, all she wanted to do was come to me. She wanted to be with me. She wanted to lay on me. She wanted to sneeze into me. I recall laying with a very, very ill child, nuzzled underneath my neck, who was periodically coughing literally into my nose and mouth, sneezing, coughing, runny nose. That was the epitome of dose exposure. And in those moments, I thought there is absolutely no way that this illness is not going to transfer from that little child to me. I will be sick in 3 days. But what do you do? Do you tell your children to go away? Do you tell them not to vomit into your bed or onto your floor? Do you tell them, actually, please don't sneeze into my face? No, you end up there in the primary care role caring for them. But the result of that is that you end up with a high dose exposure. You end up the person who is getting 1 million of those viruses literally placed into your nasal cavity, into your eyes, and down your throat. If we know that mothers are much more likely to step into these care roles when children are sick, then they're going to be the one who's going to be exposed. They're going to end up with the mom flu. And we know that little kids are vectors of disease. They go to daycare and they bring back everything. You are like, what is this medieval disease that we now have? Hoof, mouth, cough disease. Like all of a sudden you're there with whooping cough, hoof, mouth, cough disease. You're there with lice. You're there with like the bubonic plague. You don't know where they found it, but those kids found it. They brought it right back into the home and they coughed it right into your mouth. So if you're the primary caregiver, you're getting that. What it means that if men aren't stepping into that primary care role, they're not getting the same dose exposure when things go wrong, right? When children are sick, they're getting a lower dose of the illness. They're not there actually in that role, and so their exposure goes down. Now, I want to pause and say, I don't have any concrete research saying this. I am actually just looking at this idea of dose exposure and the research I've done, and I'm saying, hey, maybe this is actually creating the mom flu. And I'm giving you this example of childcare as the caregiving one, right? And I'm talking about the little kids where it's pretty clear. But I think there's other ways in which mothers' tendency to step into caregiving roles or step into housework that increases their dose exposure. And what this means is that mothers are much more likely to get the mom flu. We know that moms are more likely to take on those types of housework tasks that, again, will expose them to a higher dose of some sort of virus, right? We know that they are the ones who are clearing the Kleenexes that were left on the floor. We know that they are the ones who are changing the sheets. We know that they are the ones who are in the room often bringing in dishes or taking the dishes out when the children are sick. We know that they are the ones who are making sure the doors are opened or the windows are open when children are sick, and they're clearing the cups, they're clearing the plates, all of that may increase their risk of getting exposed. I will say for myself, I am the one that my daughter, even to this day, is always handing me stuff. Leftover chocolates, half-drunk drinks, the quarter of her sandwich that she didn't want, fruit, fill in the blank, a plate, a cup, a Kleenex. I take it. And let me tell you what I usually do. I usually freaking eat it. I usually eat that half-eaten candy bar, that quarter of the chocolate. I am also the one drinking out of her drinks because from birth, she has been handing me things and I have to figure out where to put them. And usually I put them internal to myself, into a purse, into my pocket, or into my body. And what this means is anytime that little person who's now 14, almost 15, hands me something from 0 to 15, I internalize it. Literally, I put it into my body or into my pocket or into my anything. And so I am trying to be an environmentalist. I'm trying to live the dreams I'm supposed to have. So I'm trying to reduce food waste. And the result of that is I am getting the mom flu. My husband is not. He never puts any of those things into his mouth. She hands him a half-eaten candy bar. He hands it right back to her and says, throw it away. She hands him a Kleenex. He says, I don't want that, and puts it on the table. He is not sucking up all of the stuff that she produces throughout her life, but I am, in part because this is something I did from birth, but continue to do forever. He has more self-respect, honestly. Like, I just take whatever handed to me and I take it. So what I'm saying to you is that these little tiny tasks that we do that are tied to the way in which we do more intimate care, the way we step into different types of housework, the way we maybe engage with each other where it feels like we want to sit a little bit closer, talk a little bit more intimately, are actually potentially exposing us to higher doses of illness that can create sickness or illness or cause the mom flu. We're being exposed to a million different viruses that are being brought into our lives and our families, sometimes from our children, sometimes from our partners, sometimes from our pets, sometimes from our aging parents. And I will say that we're probably doing this, and as a result of being caregivers and intimate caregivers, primary housework helpers, we are exposing ourselves to higher risk of virus. Now, what do we do about this? I don't know if we do anything. I guess what I'm saying to you is I would like to be the person who steps in to hug, to love, to be present, to lean in, to listen. This is a key and critical way that we show we care. But I want to point out that it may also expose us to risk of illness. But I also want to say that if actually you want to step out of this a little bit, if you actually are now thinking, oh, maybe I don't want to be the primary person who's picking up the Kleenexes. Maybe I don't want to be the person who's always having the baby cough down my throat. Maybe I don't want to be the person who is clearing the dishes and then therefore increasing my risk of exposure to fill in the blank, a million different viruses. That's okay too, that if you want to balance out kind of the housework and the childcare in ways that may actually help balance out the health outcomes. That it may actually mean that mothers take less time off of work sick because they're stepping out of this primary care and exposure ways, or it may help you just be a little bit more aware. I also want to say to you that it also justifies that if you need to take time for self-care, for recovery, for things that are health enhancing, you should. You want that massage, you want that meditation, you want that bath time, you want that long walk, you want to take your time for recovery, you should, because you are probably on the front line of exposure within your house. So is it in fact a misperception that our housework is giving us the mom flu? I don't actually know. I don't know the answer to this. There's no research on this yet. But I think it probably is happening, that we are probably getting dose exposure based on the ways in which we divide care at the home. So this is one other way in which women may get dinged in their career, right? You're not only taking time out of work to care for your sick children who have the flu, but then in caring for them and being the primary caregiver, you're increasing your exposure, which means then you have to take additional time out because you then get sick. And so if we can think about this intersection of care, dose exposure, illness, career outcomes, and the range, you can see it kind of touches a range of other dimensions of our lives. It's another reason why equality, equity, and sharing is so critical. So is the mom flu real? You tell me. We want to hear. We'll put up a poll. Do you agree? Feed it back to us. We have an Instagram at Misperceived Podcast. We also have an Instagram for me at Prof. Leah. And if you could, please like, subscribe, and give us 5 stars if you would be indulging me. Because we love doing this and we think it's really impactful and we love hearing from you. So, as per usual, thanks for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, you just get to come hang out with me. And I am sending you love if you are deep in the mom flu moment. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.